Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Such a pleasure to be back. I'm excited to be in this really special forum. Our last forum explored contemplative social artistry from the perspective of artists who are deploying and using meditation and contemplative practices to refine their craft. And today we have a really wonderful treat with Minna Salami, a feminist scholar, philosopher, someone who I think has contributed so much to the field. Before we dive into Mina's work, and also invite my sister Josana McDaniels to just relish in Mina's ideas around sensuous knowledge, allow me to provide some context. As a director of the fellowship program at the Garrison Institute, it's a really exciting time to be part of the legacy of this institution. As many of you know, the Garrison Institute, it has a physical building in the Hudson Valley in Garrison, New York. It used to be a Franciscan monastery that was retrofitted to facilitate retreats. And for 20 years, the Institute has not only facilitated retreats, it has invited luminaries in the contemplative sciences and in the well-being space, and all kinds of from all kinds of spiritual communities to come and host retreats. But also we've had really serious programming around marrying ancient wisdom traditions and scientific inquiry, especially contemplative studies and practices. So the impact of contemplative practices on our minds, the impact of contemplative practices on our bodies, the impact of contemplative practices on our collective well-being. It's a unique moment historically when we know so much about the brain, we know so much about psychology, we know so much about trauma, and the ways in which trauma impacts all those levels: the individual, the institutional, the interpersonal, the collective, the ideological. So that the fellowship really is a container for exploring cutting edge ideas with luminaries like Mina and Drasana. And then also we have right now 25 fellows. Oh, the wonderful human beings, all of whom are coming from different walks of life. We have psychologists, we have healers, we have sound therapists, we have embodiment practitioners, we have neuroscientists, we have anthropologists. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge the wonderful fellows that are part of the program. Before I invite Amina just to check in with us and see how she's arriving, I want to say that her work uniquely fits not just the legacy of the Institute, but this current historical moment. You see, as institutions like the Garrison Institute and many others, Omega Institute, Esalen Institute, Rhinebeck, Kirkpalu, Rowe Conference Center, many of the institutes that were formed and created post-Cultural Revolution in the United States, meaning many people went off to East Asia and other countries in the Far East and came back to the United States and Europe, blown away by the impact of spiritual traditions and contemplative practices in Buddhist and Hindu traditions. And that the growth and expansion of mindfulness, a post-cultural revolution, situated a thirst, a desire, and an interest in the forming of institutions like the Garrison Institute. What's important to note is that the research and the exploration of mindfulness, contemplative practice, you can throw yoga in there. You can even frame it as the contemplative arts or the healing arts. That the integration of not just the mind, not just mindfulness, this cognitive, almost reason-based way of sensing into non-judgmentally to the present moment, but also adding the entirety of our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our gut, For me, sensuous knowledge, Mina's thinking around the integration of the intuitive, the integration of the logical, the integration of reason, and almost the transpersonal, has been for me an example of not just how we produce new knowledge, but how we leverage a tool that is inside of us to literally walk in the dark. And by walk in the dark, I mean just navigating these current times of ours where there's so much is happening. And I want to close our just my opening kind of remarks by just thanking her, thanking you, Mina, for the writing. I just visualize you just writing and the ink flowing through the pen. I visualize you kind of like stroking your keyboards and deleting sentences and deleting drafts and copy and pasting to generate not just sensuous knowledge, but the numerous articles that you've written over the last 10 years. I'll close by saying that Mina is not here alone. She's not here alone. She comes from a lineage of thinkers in the Black feminist tradition, from Audre Lorde to Bell Hooks. You could even trace her back to Sojourner Truth. I'll stop there. Mina, I'm sorry. I had to give you your flowers. How are you?
Wow. That was so beautiful, so powerful, such incredible words. Thank you, Angel. And thank you to the Garrison Institute, to everything that has sort of coalesced so that we can join forces today in this conversation. I'm good. I'm especially feeling good right now. I'm really excited to be sharing this space with you and Drasana and everybody, the very many people who are here. Thank you all for joining us. No, I really appreciate everything you said, and it resonates with me deeply, as you know. But I felt almost a little bit emotional at the very end, and not because of you were praising me and by saying that I belong to this lineage of now ancestors. I mean, everybody you mentioned, even Bell Hooks, is now an ancestor. Whew, I don't know why that. Yeah, I mean, actually, the response to the question how I am is I've been feeling this day started out kind of. I've been feeling evoked since I woke up because I woke up to a few messages from friends, from people I know that touched me. Nothing major, they just sort of really touched on my heartstrings. And well, in one of them, there was a contemplation about death, but it was sort of light, nevertheless. But as I've gone about the day, I've just had this strong sense today of feeling very, very grateful to be alive. One, thinking about, I went for a walk in the park. I'm in Germany. The day is really beautiful. The sun was out. Everything looked stunning. I could hear people laughing. I could see couples happy holding hands. There was a rave somewhere. It just felt like, what a thing to be alive. And then on the other hand, I've also been grappling a lot lately with thoughts about, sort of persistent and perennial injustices in the world, prejudices, and the ways in which even when we find ourselves, having progressive conversations with like-minded people, how there's still so many obstacles and barriers to overcome in by way of gender, race, ethnicity, class, all of these structural things. And so, yeah, today I'm feeling like I'm really, in life, stuck in the many facets of life.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And one of the questions that I was gonna begin to ask is just what you've been thinking a lot about lately, and you partly answered that. And so what I just take a moment just to sit with that question. If there's anything else you'd like to share around what's been top of mind, heart, body, spirit for you, and then I'll take a moment to think about that. If there's anything else you want to share, and then what we'll end up doing is I'm going to invite Drew and I to just mirror back to you what kind of we were struck by, especially by your work, but also the book, Sensuous Knowledge. For those of you listening, check out Minna's book, Sensuous Knowledge, and then let you kind of just sit in that resonance, and you can kind of sense into what's coming up for you as a response. And then we'll do kind of 2 rounds of that. And then at the end of those 2 rounds, I have a couple questions around what the edge of your work is.
Okay.
Or even maybe where haven't you gone yet, that there's a desire too. Let's see if we get there. In the spirit of bio, we're gonna get lost together. The trickster is here. Bio is always. So yeah. Anything else on your end in terms of no pressure, in terms of what you're thinking about, what's top of mind lately?
Yeah. God, so a lot of things, always like the image you painted of the words flowing. It happens occasionally, but for the most part, it's not as glamorous as that. It's such a frustrating process to be writing and trying to develop several ideas at the same time. Frustrating, but also incredibly meaningful. It gives my life a strong sense of purpose. But it's difficult, is what I'm meaning to say. And yeah, at the moment, I'm writing a book about African feminism, or key themes in African feminism. So that's one thing I've been thinking about. I'm always thinking about sensuous knowledge. I didn't realize this necessarily when I was writing the book and when it was published, that it was going to be, I didn't realize that it was going to be as much of a lifelong project as I now realize. It's always in some way at the forefront of my thinking. But one concrete thing, or sort of concrete, that I've been reflecting on and feeling really frustrated about lately, and it has to do with, this thing that we're calling the polycrisis, and how there are so many compounding crises in society today. But one of them being the climate crisis, which, kind of is getting the deserved attention to some extent, more attention anyway than it has in decades. And yet I've been thinking a lot about what kinds of spaces decisions about the climate emergency, which of course intersects with all of the other emergencies and crises we face, about social inequality, poverty, wars, all of issues that have to do with the global order, and the kinds of spaces where decisions are being made are spaces where which are predominantly shaped and controlled and steered by, to generalize, let's say, by scientists and politicians. And I'm finding, this very simple and straightforward question, that where are the poets, the philosophers, the artists, and furthermore, where are the children and the elderly, in making decisions about these big, huge issues that impact all of us. And it should be so obvious that, because this is our shared planet and our shared societies and cultures and educational systems and political institutions. And yet, the decision makers are pretty much technicians of some kind of a political or a scientific nature. And I'm wondering, as a consequence of that frustration that I feel with that why is it that even though we've been asking this question in different formats for so long, and we're so many who are thinking about different ways that we could approach social justice issues. And yet we just can't change that fact. We can't penetrate that layer where, real sort of decision-making power sits. And yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, so much there. So much there. And I can hear Drew thinking as well. I'd love to bring Drew in here. So Drew and I, so everyone, Drew McDaniel is a dear colleague of mine who's an incredible mother, sister scholar, coming from also the Black feminist tradition. And just really grateful that you're here with us. And I didn't want to have this conversation by myself. And I thought about who could I lean on, and Drew came to mind. So thank you, Drew, for saying yes. I'll say a few things, and then I'll let Drew kind of just share a little bit about some of the things she's done in response to sensuous knowledge in particular. As you know, Minna, language is so important. I mean, you're a master of the pen and the keyboard. I know it might not be as fluid all the time, but you're a master of that craft. And I think one of the things that you've done for me, at least conceptually, a few things. But one is the power of a few concepts, but one in particular, and I'll talk about it in a second. But as you know, Ibrahim Kendi's work over the last several years have become very popular around thinking about anti-racist education and being anti-racist, especially in the U.S., as so much police brutality has unfolded before our eyes. And one of the things he talks about is the co-joint twins of racialized capitalism and white supremacy. And that concept really blew my mind in terms of how he just brought those two together to kind of name this complicated system that both privileges certain communities, and it embeds itself in certain practices and laws and histories, at the same time tied to this global political economy that stratifies and orders trauma and oppression and access and resources. So when you write about Euro patriarchal knowledge as a similar kind of conjoint forces, I found it just so useful for my clarity, for my sense of clarity and visioning for not only what is happening, but also what could be. And in particular, what could be in terms of not only how you name these structures, and you really wrestle deeply with patriarchy and male dominance, but it's not a centering. It's like it's a naming, and then there's a taking up space from a feminist lens, from a Black feminist. And I think that's really powerful as a scholar, for you to give these structures the attention they not deserve, but that we need in order to really be clear about the systems that we're navigating. But then the way that you take up space, centering your Nigerian culture, pulling in the ways when you bring music into your analysis, the way you bring social critique and philosophy. So just wanted to appreciate how you, in that book and just in your work, in an accessible way as well, you've been able to just take up so much space, yet not be as hamstrung by the very systems you're trying to sidestep, And as my camera there even moved just to accent the point. But Drew, you had some incredible thoughts as well.
Yeah. Naming and taking up space is definitely, I think, what you do really beautifully. So when I was engaging with your work, I found myself in so many conversations with you. When you mentioned Lauryn Hill from Unplug, I remember weeping to that project, finding myself think I was reading bell hooks for the first time also at that time, and I wasn't a student yet. But in conversation with you, I wrote back a lot. And one of the things that I said is what I so appreciate about this work is how you generously pour libations with the wisdom of living and ancestral luminaries throughout. You generously pour these libations in such an effective way. You bring your child self to now, and then you weave this story of them, of how you came to know yourself better, of how you came to sort of know the misrecognition, I want to say the misrecognition that Europatriarchy subjects us to. You flip the script. But what I really loved also, because we're having this conversation about reimagining, but it's really hard for people to imagine. And you did it. You did it with this book. You called it not a protest book, not a smash the patriarchy book, but a progress book, right? Like an integral book, a healing book. And so, yeah, I'm just so deeply, deeply moved at how you are able to do that. And to do it with these chapters of beauty. There's something you said, there's a lot of things you said that stuck with me, but one of them, if I may, is do beauty, dear reader. Do beauty like your life depends on it, because in many ways it does. All our lives do. Beauty in action is art, and the more we strive to make of life and art, the more beautiful our world and we ourselves will become. I have never seen a person, no matter what age, look, ability, height, this or that, be passionate about life and not be beautiful. I mean, this on the heels of you deconstructing the way that such a force has been flattened, right? Like beauty, such a vibrant force, such a necessity for us to encounter, for you to like make a statement like that. Like it's so powerful. And there's so many of those. There's so many of those. I think one thing that I want to also acknowledge is that I think this idea of reimagining and this idea of like what you're talking about with the poly crises and angel, racial capitalism and white supremacy is this return to the poetic, this return to the sensuous, this return to the ability to hear with our whole selves and to think with each other. It's the only thing I can think of that will eventually help us practice differently in the world. And I know it sounds to me like when I sometimes discuss imagination or reimagining, people say fantasy, but it's not that. It's audacity. It's audacity, to reimagine. And that's what you gave us. That's what you handed us so beautifully. Is this meditation on sensuous knowledge, the only knowledge that I like to continue to move forward with. There was no name for it before, but that's it. Like, that's it. How we know with our whole being.
Thank you. Do you want me to? Please. Did I try to respond to all of this? Thank you. That is so, for the very generous engagement with my work. Thank you to both of you, and thank you, Prasanna, with what you just stepped in and said. I find it somewhat difficult to receive praise of that nature, but I think what you said about the libations and then that particular segment that you read about doing beauty, that flowed together so nicely, because I got the expression from Toni Morrison. And she writes in The Bluest Eye. It's a novel, but one of the characters is struggling with beauty, as many of you know who have read the book, and says this thing about discovering that you could do beauty. And I wanted to bring that phrase into an essay into a non-fiction, into a sort of a real and embodied setting, as I had set up through Sensuous Knowledge, to explore. And yeah, so there's always this continuity in the work. And I think what I've, I mean, the sort of inspiration for bringing in all of those voices, you know, the voices of writers, of Black feminists from all around the world, from particularly from the US and from the African continent, and Europe, because those are the parts of the world that I'm familiar with, is because of the conversations that I have with them in a similar way to what you were describing, having with my words in Sensuous Knowledge. When I've encountered, whether it's the album music of Lauryn Hill or the books of people like Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, Wangari Maathai, etc., I'm having these very reflective, deep, and insightful conversations. And I came to realize that, you know, they aren't just conversations; they are knowledge. That rumination, that dialogue, that contemplation is actual bona fide knowledge. And we live in this society that doesn't allow us to think of it in that way. You know, we're almost urged to see it as something that happens sort of outside of knowledge production in our inner worlds, and particularly when it's women who are producing this art, this insight, you know, we don't see it as something that has real value in society. And so, yeah, as my feminist journey has, it has shifted a lot in a sense from where it started, because it started, I mean, first, I think when you discover that you're a feminist, it does have to do with voice and with almost, you could say, with the soul. You know, there's a sense of a striving for personhood that isn't shackled by whatever types of oppressive elements that are there in front of you. But then as you start to engage with the movement and the literature, a lot of it is very political and very, you know, it's very focused on structures, and rightly so. But that ties together with what you were saying, Angel, about the work of someone like Ibram Kendi. You know, what he's exploring in a lot of the work is the structural, you know, which is the capitalist system, or the white supremacist system, or in feminist work, it would be the patriarchal system in addition. And of course, I'm also grappling with those things in Sensuous Knowledge, and still am in all of my work. But at some point in my feminist journey, without really like realizing it, I started to realize that the thing that I was resisting was of an intellectual nature as well. And, you know, I mean, by intellect, I mean in the real sense of the word intellectual, like what we know and why do we know it and how do we know it. And maybe I can try to like clarify all of these ultimately quite complex and maybe to some extent abstract things that we're discussing. And they necessarily are abstract in the sense because a lot of it has to do with our inner worlds, both individually and collectively. And so, you know, as you said, Angel, language is so important here, but I still think it's always useful to give an image where possible. And so maybe we can think of, like, imagine a sandbox. And imagine that there's a little girl playing in the sandbox, and, you know, she builds, let's say, 3 castles, right? And then a little boy comes along and says, hey, can we play together? And she's like, yeah, sure, come in. And he comes into the castle and he's using her toys, her spade and whatever, and they're playing, but he builds, let's say, 29 castles. And he puts, you know, flags on them, and he's beating himself on the chest, and he's like, yeah, like, look how many castles I've got. And at this point, it could still even be fun because there's no necessary competition. There are 2 kids playing, right? But what I'm describing with Europatriarchal knowledge is 2 things. One, that it is, and this is where the sort of this thing that I'm saying, the intellectual element of societal and oppressive systems matters, as well as the structural, because the one thing that Europatriarchal knowledge does is create a narrative that is obsessed with rationalism, measuring, so like technical things that can be measured. And so Europatriarchal knowledge in this sandbox would say that knowledge or reality is the sand castles, because those are the things that can be measured. And furthermore, the second thing that Europatriarchal knowledge does is create a power dynamic, which is why, you know, the label Europatriarchal, because otherwise I could just talk about technical knowledge or materialism or rationalism, but it's the fact that there's this power dynamic that is the second layer. So it then would be that, you know, the boys' sandcastles, which can be measured, the whole 29 of them, not only that they can be measured and he has more, but that gives him more power than the little girl. Now, what are the things that are in the sandbox that we cannot measure? We can't measure the feeling of playing together, the feeling of making a friend, or maybe even that some anger that may be happening between the two children. We can't measure the sounds that are around them, or the smells that are, and even if we could like measure the decibels or something like that, we can't measure the experience, the subjectivity of what it is like for the little boy or the little girl to hear a specific sound or smell something specific. And we certainly can't measure the amount of sand grains. So, you know, all of this is exactly the way that we are now living and approaching both real political crises, such as climate change or social inequality or wars, with like what we can measure, and then we exclude, on the other hand, all the things that are felt, that are relational and subjective. And what that means is that we are detached from reality, because if reality is the sandbox and there are all these things taking place, but we are only focusing on what can be measured and the power dynamic, and everything else is forgotten about. And so we, you know, it's a deceptive and delusional way of living. And I really believe, as you know, you were saying, Rosanna, like there's a completely different way of being in the world. We can't have a perfect society where everything functions in a completely, you know, poetic, beautiful, harmonious way, but we could have much more clarity about our societies, and that in return would improve our relationships by far.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Just want to create a little bit of space here, just to allow us to hear the resonance of that share, and almost maybe, just maybe, activate our sensuous knowledge as we're in this dialogue. You know, so inviting everybody to kind of really settle into their chair and to see if you can kind of take in all this information, not just with your ears, eyes, but with your whole being. And, you know, we titled it Sensuous Knowledge as almost like a contemplative practice, because I do think that sensuous knowledge is part of an extension, a sister practice of mindfulness, of those ancient wisdom traditions that allowed us to still ourselves in order to be in relation with the present moment, the present reality, if you were to define mindfulness or contemplative practice in that way. And I'm thinking about the work of one of our fellows, Dr. Steve Oliver Thurston, and he defines contemplation as a feasting, on our life. And so I see a connection there between how he defines contemplation and then what sensuous knowledge, at least for me, is in the lineage of ancient wisdom traditions that are deployed to allow us to be more alive in our individual context. So I just wanted to kind of give the community a sense for why we would frame sensuous knowledge as a contemplative practice, And then Sister Minna, Drew and I spent a lot of time talking about your notion of exouissance. You can invite me. You can clarify in terms of the pronunciation. But Drew, could you step in here, because you and I had a lot of powerful thinking around that concept that comes out of Minna's book in terms of its relationship to power.
Yeah. Would you say the word, please, Minna?
Yeah.
Exusions is how I pronounce it.
Okay. Beautiful, beautiful word. Exusions. Yeah. So what I thought about it is just about what a powerful way to reconceive of power. What a important way to reconceive of power, not power with, not power over, but power just is. And I thought about how it's kind of like a liberation, like quiet resistance, like liberation work. Like in Hawaii, there's a music entitled Nahi Nahi, right? That on the strings, and the way that is a type of, it's a soft, gentle power that or force that resists sort of these historical processes, practices, and narratives, and it's beautiful. This idea of exusions is also because it recognizes, like you were talking about the river, you're talking about how the river worked, and I see this as a way that it's like these, like you mentioned, these branches that face obstacles, but may then branch off and divide, and they keep coursing and they keep finding their way, and it's continuous. And so I appreciate it in particular as a single woman with children who has, and I have a lot of joy. And at the same time, I'm also acutely aware of the consequences and effects of structural oppression and, legacies of oppression. And this idea of the obstacle and the way that power moves through, but also branches, is such an empowering way to think about how we can move with what is, or move in our life. And then I think you talked about it sort of as life and aliveness thrusting from within, as opposed to this idea of something we have to take from something else, but that it's always coursing. I think it's really, really wonderful, and it aligns with some of what I think about in terms of like how we turn towards what arises in our lives. So when I came across that whole concept as this complex process, it just really resonated for me. hope that's
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
No, that was a beautiful contemplation. And actually, in some sense, I was thinking, just bouncing or connecting what you both just said, exusions is contemplation. And contemplation is the essence of life. And so I love that you titled this gathering as you did, because what else, if we're not contemplating, or if we're not able to contemplate, of course we can't be that present in every single moment of our lives, although that would be nice, but we do get distracted. But if we don't have space for contemplation, which is something that, as Black people, as women, as Black women, has been denied for us in so many epochs and in so many different ways. But contemplation is the very thing that gives you clarity. It's the thing that means you're not just existing, but that you are present to life. You can assess your subjectivity, going back to that word again, because otherwise things are just happening to you. And everything I say, I mean, not only on an individual scale, but also collectively, like that capacity, that space to be able to assess what is happening around you, and, how you embody that, how you, what kinds of desires and griefs and fears but also hopes and joys, what are the things that happen in your environment, in your relationships with other individuals, with communities, and with society at large? What kinds of emotions do they evoke in you? And it is from that place that you also can start to sort of sense into power, what power means, what it feels like when it is there or when it is removed, when it is denied. And that whole process, that's what I was going through when I was writing. I knew that I was going to write a chapter on power, but I didn't know that I was going to have coin this concept, exusions, that just came while I was working on the chapter, because I was contemplating. And I was intentionally doing was contemplating. So I've always been drawn to water, as you, like, my background maybe speaks to that as well today. I'm the daughter of the Yoruba deity Yemoja. And so wherever I travel, wherever I go, or even when I'm just staying put, it's essential for me to try and, visit a water body daily if I can. And when I was writing about power, I was at a point in my life when I was grieving. I was, things were difficult, and so I was going to a lot of rivers, spending a lot of time with rivers, and it was just there suddenly. Exusions. I had come across the word somewhere. The ancient Greek word for power is exousia. And because I'd been writing this chapter, I was, of course, researching the etymology and, power in different languages. So I'd come across the word, but I just put it to the side. And then watching the way that rivers behave, indeed, the way that they move beyond obstacles. Those things just came together during contemplation and became exusions.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And again, to allow the community here and ourselves some time to catch up, to sink in, to settle into what's coming up. I think it's really important to highlight that it's sensuous knowledge, a form of contemplation, a beautiful way to think through and do just this taking in of our life, our relation to the world, our relation to power, whether we have it or not, how it comes, how it goes. But very important that through that contemplation, with this concept of exhaustion, through that contemplation and that sensuous process, there are these moments where you become clear on how you can intervene. I think that's a major point. That it's not just this, oh, I'm just gonna just be mindful, because that's part of the pitfalls of the mindfulness movement, is that there was a lot of emphasis on well-being and zenning out, and then you hear concept like practicing off the cushion. Practicing off the cushion is an expression around using that peace, that merit, that well-being that you generate while you're in zazen or whatever pose you're in, that you use it to intervene, to respond, to change the very systems and structures that produce the suffering that you escape from through the practice in the first place. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that sensuous knowledge is really contemplative social action in a way. And just really, really excited about how it evolves. Minna, just wanted to give people an opportunity to hear more about the role of your Nigerian background and the Yoruba tradition in how you've thought a lot around sensuous knowledge, especially how even this idea of how exusions came, how it came, and your relationship to how it came. I think the ori, the ogbu, like the different concepts in Yoruba tradition that allowed you to define and think about intuitive thinking and rational thought in relation to contemplation and sensuous knowledge.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for emphasizing that, this is about, even though it's about things that can be quite introspective, when we're talking about exusions, contemplation, knowledge generally, there is a very strong connection to the politics of the society that surrounds us. And the reason for that, and this will tie in with what you just asked about Nigeria and Ogbon, is that, again, I'm going to use an image. So like, imagine you're in a house and it's a rectangular shaped house and there's a window on each end, and you're standing in the middle. And if you look out of the window on the left, you see this beautiful meadow, and a river and a beach, and it's all very serene and gorgeous. But if you look out of the window on the right, there's a fire, buildings are crashing down. What sensuous knowledge does, and exusions and contemplation for that matter, is that you can't deny either, you're in the house, both are real. And I think that there was a period in time when some groups, groups that we here all belong to, where all we were allowed to do was be in the room where you could just see the fire. And part of our healing work, as women, as Black people, was to say that, no, we need to get away. We need to meditate. We need to sit on the cushion, all of these things, or it could also be, about bling. We need to live a certain like flashy lifestyle, because we've just been looking at this fire for so long. But that time is not now, right now. I think what we need is that clarity that, the two and many more things exist. And maybe this is the reason that I have these kinds of images, and why this kind of sensibility informs my writing and the conceptual frameworks that I hope bring value to others, that I offer in the hope that they bring value, is because I indeed am Nigerian. I grew up in Nigeria. I still spend a lot of time there. And I grew up in a society where things were dire. You know, I was a patriotic child. I really enjoyed growing up in Lagos, where I lived, and found so much beauty and joy, and I really loved my people and my culture. And yet, you know, it was also, my reality was such that I sometimes saw people get killed on my way to school. I came from a kind of middle-class background, which meant that we didn't always have electricity, we didn't always have water. There's no escaping the reality of injustice. You know, I knew that from the moment I had any kind of consciousness. I could see it all the time, that the world was unjust. And I had some sense that it had to do with these big structural issues, even if I wouldn't have been able to articulate it. And so sensuous knowledge, you know, ultimately, it comes from that. It comes from that. Sometimes I describe it as, you know, it would be the baby of rage and joy if they got married. You know, it's like, it's that that inescapable sorrow of how much suffering people unnecessarily have to go through, and the rage and anger that I feel about that, but also what you can see through that other window, that perspective of beauty, of doing beauty. And so I'll just close this response with the Yoruba creation myth. So Yoruba is one of the ethnic groups in Nigeria today. And in the creation myth of the Yorubas, the story goes that that God granted knowledge to the people because knowledge was needed to create beautiful societies. But God, Oduduwa, knew that in order for the societies to actually manifest the knowledge that God in, the Yoruba God is gender neutral, that they gave the people, they had to have two types of knowledge. So the word for knowledge in Yoruba is ogbon, but there's ogbon inu and ogbon ori, which respectively translated mean knowledge of the gut and knowledge of the head. So kind of like emotional intelligence and rationalism. And so the God knew that people had to have both, and that to only have one of ogbon, one type of ogbon, would be to only be partly wise, and to create a society that only was partly wise. And so sensuous knowledge is the Yoruba creation myth, translated into nonfiction, social criticism, feminist theory, all of these things. But that's really the idea, the driving idea behind it.
Thank you for sharing that. I thought it was really important for that to come through for the community. Drew, I want to give you space just to one last thought in regards to the resonance of this work for you, and then I'll do just a light framing, and then turn to the audience and turn to the community for questions and for thoughts, and engage Minna more with everyone. Anything else for you, Drew, that you'd like to share?
The thing that just comes up again and again for me, that I think is another part of what makes this book and your thinking so important, is that you name, you keep coming back to the real. You keep coming back to reality. You hold both. You hold reality, and you're not saying we have to turn away from reality. You're actually saying we have to turn towards reality. But the way that we turn towards it is with more than this one way of knowing, in particular, the Euro-patriarchal way. I think it's a really important conversation because things are hard. And I think so many people want to turn away. And I understand why. And at the same time, I understand that it's essential that we find a way to turn towards what is, if we're to do anything about it, if we're to transform it, if we're to heal it, if we're to change it, if we're to reimagine it, you know, the way that you say it. So I'm very grateful that you call us to sitting with real frustrations, as you write, sitting with the real frustrations, as opposed to flying over them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's also this, there's this idea somehow, you know, one of the things that's become very clear for me in my work is, as much as, and I think, did you write this? Toni Morrison, when you were talking about superiority, you were sharing her comment about superiority. No?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a while since I revisited that.
Yeah, it's all fresh for me. But just these ideas about, like, you know, the way that we're seen also, right? The way that we're seen, there is this curiosity around how do we do what we do? And by that, I mean anyone who was not, you know, white and male. And I appreciate that you don't cast them all into one box, because we know that there's variance, right? But the way that we're viewed is in this very powerless kind of way. And what you say is, no, we're sitting with reality. And so what I notice in cross-racial, you know, cross-cultural spaces is that people are coming to reckon with the fact that this way of being in the world isn't working for anyone anymore. That everyone has to sit with reality. That, for example, you know, in relationship to the conversation about Toni Morrison, being kept doesn't necessarily mean you have joy, or that you're a vessel of joy, as you say, you know. And so I think that this is a time when we all are sort of coming closer to know more about how it is that we might turn towards reality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining me in this inquiry. As I turn to the audience for any questions, any thoughts, and I'm a big fan of pushback. So if you disagree, bring it. I wanna just kind of not justify, but give some background around why we started the way we did. Why did I start talking about Minna the way I did? And why would Drew and I start a dialogue with such a premier scholar by actually framing not just praise, but the resonance of her work? So often when there are certain kinds of labor that scholars have to do in the field, and that labor unfolds in a variety of ways. And sometimes in talks like this, there's labor that's required to talk about, to re-explore, to explain. And we wanted to support Minna with that labor, one. Two, in the feminist tradition, there's this notion of care. There's a book by Nell Noddings that came out in the 90s called The Ethics of Care. And it was a profound, you could say simple, but not in the context that it came out of. It was an invitation to really talk about care and how we care for communities and how we nurture communities and it was integration of philosophy and feminist scholarship. So the call to care, Nell Noddings. How do you provide an engrossed experience of holding a community, of holding a person? Fascinating. Now, Nell Noddings was a white feminist scholar. And what you see is almost maybe a little bit under a decade later is you have feminist scholars take the notion of care and flip it on its head and say, well, we need critical care. You see, different communities need different kinds of care because different communities experience things differently. So the ethics of care, the ethics of critical care invite us to, on the one hand, appreciate Minna, and through our compliments and our praise, allow us to provide a mirror to remind her and to invite her to know what she already knows, that she's on a good path, and that too, that she's not alone, and we can lift this work with her. So I wanted to really be clear around why it's so important for us to start with that celebration of her mind and her life work in the tradition of care, especially Black feminist critical care. Minna, before I move into the audience, is there anything in your heart right now to share? No pressure.
I want to just say thanks again for that, that support and that acknowledgement, but also to once again reconnect it to the lineage. The feminist tradition is amazing, and I feel so blessed that it was one that I came upon in my life. I mean, I feel, to be perfectly honest, that it was inevitable. I think I was born a feminist, and I am, I'm living the purpose that I was born to live. But of course, that in itself is a process of discovery and rediscovery and forgetting and remembering and all of that. But the feminist tradition is so powerful because it is a tradition, because it is a lineage, because it is, centuries of women being in reality, as Drew put it. And the quote, just to share with people who are here with us, and I'm paraphrasing, but Toni Morrison, the thing about superiority that Drew was talking about, she said, Black women have always seen ourselves as superior to white women. And she said it to be provocative, but what she meant was that in having to be in reality, to not be pampered, to not be cuddled, to have to sort of face the harshness and toughness of life, which of course is not the method through which one wishes to come to reality, but that was nevertheless the thing that has made us not be able to escape. And that was also what I was pointing to with, my growing up in Nigeria and coming from a country in which there is so much reality, if you like, not only from like the Euro-patriarchal order, but also the patriarchal order. Nigeria is very patriarchal. Women suffer in the country, as we do everywhere, but in specific ways. And so the feminist lineage, in its capacity and ability and enabling us to see reality, exactly as you put it, Drew, like we can't change anything if we don't see it clearly. And that's what feminism is about, is shining a light on oppression so that we can change it. It's not just shining a light, for the sake of it. It's precisely so that we can change it. And Euro-patriarchal knowledge, it's not even that it is a different way or necessarily even an oppressive way, which it is, but what it is a delusion, and that was why that image, I gave you the image of the sandbox, because it's a complete lie. And so when we say that when we're trying to encourage people to not think of this as some kind of escape, actually Euro-patriarchal knowledge, so the conventional system that we're living in, is the escape, because it's a delusion, and it's a delusion in which nobody comes out happy. Some people have a lot more privileges than others, but everybody is living under this complete, utter, nonsensical, deceiving delusion. And so reality is, it's messy, it's complex, it's difficult, because in large part because we have been deprived of it for so long. But also because that's the nature of it. You know, nature is not predictable. Nature is not always kind. Nature can be brutal, as we know. Like, look at how many natural disasters happen. But reality is beautiful, and it's something incredibly beautiful to witness. And we need all of the tools that we possibly can amass in order to get to that jewel of reality. And sensuous knowledge is one of those tools. Exusions is one of those. Contemplation is one of those. Community, honesty is so key, because if we agree that Euro-patriarchal knowledge is deceptive and delusional, then it is dishonest. And so what we do, and this is, again, the feminist tradition is so good at it, is poking at the lies, poking at the illusions, so that we can become more honest. So yeah, as many tools, we need more tools. It's not about finding the one way. It's finding all the possible ways in which one can become present to reality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Minna. I want to hear some voices. There's some questions coming up in the chat, which I'll bring up in a moment. I want to hear some voices. So if you have a question or a thought, raise your hand. We're gonna do this thing called question stacking, meaning would love for you to be as succinct as possible with your question or your thought, and then we're gonna hear a few questions at once, and just kind of let the inquiry kind of just like echo in this digital space, and then we'll see what inspires as far as a response. So we'll do question stacking, meaning we'll hear a few questions at once. I'll bring up some of the ones in the chat in a moment. I do want to enliven our conversation with some voices. Anyone would like to bring their voice into this conversation with a quick question? So please raise your hand at this point. We'll have about 19, 18 minutes to sit with the audience. And I will get to the ones in the chat in a second. Anybody, feel free to start raising your hand. And as you're raising your hand, I'll start to pull from the chat. In the chat, there was one question around thinking about contemplation and everyday life. So how does, like, in terms of practices, and like, how do we apply this in our personal lives? There was a question from a colleague inviting us to share, how does this look like in our personal lives around contemplation, and what are some practices, what are some ways of engaging in deep sensuous knowledge production. There was also another question around, how do we think about the concept of exusions, and how do we teach that to young people? There was a colleague who teaches young kids, maybe between like 4 and 12 years old, that kind of elementary school, kind of like, how do we support young people with kind of accessing exusions? And then my sister Zara King, Sister Zara, are you feeling moved to bring your voice in this space? Sister Zara is one of our fellows, Dr. Zara King. She's so getting it.
Fair.
Yeah. And then, so there's a question for you, Minna. How old were you when you realized your voice matters? Was it early on? How is this important?
And how that was important?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions and for being present and engaging. I'll use an example of something that we all do in order to respond to the first question of how we may practice sensuous knowledge. and something that we all do is eat breakfast. And so I'll just use the example of that because it's so mundane, and I want you to think about, what you had for breakfast this morning, for example. Also, like I had some, what did I have actually? I had some toast. And if you think about the way that you might use, or the way that we typically would go about describing our world through Euro-patriarchal knowledge, would be to describe the nutritional content of what you ate. So how many calories was in the bread, how much, how many carbs, how many grams of fat, this, that. So again, whatever we can measure is the only thing that exists in this paradigm that we live in, which detaches us completely from the actual thing that happened, which is, where you could describe the texture of your breakfast. If you also ate some bread, what kind of texture did it have? What kinds of sounds did you hear as you were having breakfast? Could you hear cars honking, children laughing, rain? How did it feel? Like, did it nourish you? Did you manage to have a moment of stillness before starting your day? And what is the tradition of the food that you had? If it was bread, what kind of, is there a baking tradition to it? So this is a kind of application of sensuous knowledge to your breakfast, to something that's super mundane. And my idea in using that as an example is to say that you can start small, or you can just, it's not even a question of starting. This is something we all know how to do. And in the process, not forgetting the rational, the scientific or whatever, but remembering that everything has a subjectivity, because, and this is important, this is about power, because what Euro-patriarchal knowledge does, if you remember in the beginning, I said it's on the one hand obsessing with what can be measured, but it does that in order to deny our subjectivity and hence continue to execute a very specific power dynamic. And so if we start to expand our minds and refuse the lie, even on the level of things that are mundane, such as what we eat for breakfast, then we can start to think further. So also in the beginning, I shared that I was thinking about how we may address the climate emergency. If we now moved, if we zoomed out from our zoomed in breakfast to like what we imagine, what we envision for society to look like, a meeting about the climate emergency would include, as I said, the voices of children, of elderly people of all backgrounds, of course, indigenous people, but also artists and poets, and not just there on the side in some extra session, but, like as they do, they'll have like an artist perform in the break. No, we need artists to also make the decisions, to also be part of making the decisions. We need people like us, like philosophers, thinkers, among others, because we think about these questions. The scientists and the politicians, they think about what can be measured. So that's, a small example and a big example of how sensuous knowledge can be lived, and, what we should be striving for with it, as I view it. How to teach young people exusions. It's the same kind of thing. It's really important to teach young people that that their voice matters, that what they perceive in the world, how they feel their subjectivity, when they feel heard, when they feel afraid, not just as individuals, because we all feel that. That's part of being a human, a living being, to feel fear, to feel worry, anxiousness, all of these things. But when young people are feeling it in response to societal patterns, as teachers, as carers, and as adults, period, as people who have been on this planet for longer than them, what we can do is to give them permission to speak about that, to have a voice about those subjective feelings. Because in Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which I'll keep repeating this being a deception, deceiving and delusional system, it's precisely, I mean, it's already from childhood, but it's precisely at that cusp between childhood and adulthood where people are the most susceptible to these deceptions and delusions. And one way of really reinforcing that is by denying the subjective feelings. And so in order, again, to bring the honesty into the space, we can really enable that for young people, while always also encouraging them to do the work of reading. This is not only about feeling. Reading, the intellect is a whole system of the mind, body, and soul, and all of that should be nurtured. I think it's really important. My very earliest memory in life ever, like the first thing I can remember, is feminist anger. I would, of course, not have described it as such, but I was about 4 or 5. That's my earliest memory. And it was just this feeling of unfreedom. Like, I can't tell you exactly what it was, but there was a sense that it was something that boys were allowed to do that girls weren't. And I felt really, really angry about that. But that was not the sort of key moment. I think what really, there were several things. I went through so many near-death experiences in my life. I was kidnapped. I ate poison, like so many things that have shaped the person that I've become. But perhaps the key thing and relevant in this space is that when I was 21, I had what I discovered later is called automatic writing. And I had an experience of that where I started writing in my journal and was ready to stop intellectually, but physically I couldn't stop. And I was holding, to the point I was holding my right hand, trying to stop it from writing, but it wouldn't. And I was only sort of writing toward the right and not down. So I was eventually I'd torn out so many sheets of paper from the journal, and my entire floor was just filled with this scribbling in a handwriting that wasn't really mine, thoughts that I didn't really perceive myself to having. And this was extremely scary for me at the time. I come from a Muslim family, but I had decided I wanted to become a Christian when I was a child. So all of my references were in like organized religion. I thought what was happening to me was the devil was like possessing my body. And I was really scared. And I spoke to my dad. He was the one person, my dad is from Nigeria. He's a real sort of repository of Yoruba ancestral wisdom. And he was the one person that I felt I could confide in, and he wouldn't say to me that this is, go to church or go to the mosque. And he said that it was that we would see a Yoruba priest of sorts, a babalawo, and that I should keep the papers, and I did. But it wasn't until like maybe 2 years after that this happened, and I was told that it was a gift. And so I lived for about 2 years with this fear and desperation that what was going on with me. And that led me to seek out sort of new agey people, anyone that I felt could help me with the quandary. And in that process, I encountered a lot of spiritual work. I encountered shamanism, I encountered feminism, and most of all, I started to write. And so that really is like a defining event in my life.
Yeah, that's powerful. Powerful, sis. Thank you so much for sharing all of those experiences with us, just to kind of give all of the ideas that we explored kind of a personal trajectory. As we begin to close, I just want to kind of name a couple things that we didn't touch on that came up for me. Yeah, like the role of artificial intelligence in this inquiry in terms of sensuous knowledge and these synthetic beings that are part of our ecosystem now and are able to engage in incredible computational knowledge production, yet as of now, might not necessarily have the consciousness. So I was kind of thinking about so many other things as we were closing. And I do sense that we do need to have you back, sister, and then maybe at some point have you back at the Garrison Institute in the physical facility. I want to invite everyone in the room and those of you who will watch this in the future. There'll be limited access to this only for about a couple of weeks, and then we'll be storing it in our archive to support and respect Minna's work. But just taking a moment to appreciate Minna's work and the time that it's taken her to arrive at this point in her development. So just taking a moment, everybody, to in the chat, just to kind of lift praise for Minna as we close out, and really just support with inviting a long career. May I read your books when I'm 90 in my rocking chair.
Thank you, brother. Amen to that.
Yeah, leveraging my rocking chair as a sensuous tool for thinking, and the rocking chair as a tool. Yes, so
I'm gonna ask you for your age afterwards, because I then need to live either like longer or which I would love to do. So yeah, we can make that pact.
yes. So as you can see, Minna, you can check out the chat and just take in that appreciation and that love. And Drew, any final words for you as this incredible opportunity to engage with a scholar and thinker like Minna? I wanted to give you an opportunity to just to share some closing words from your perspective.
Oh, I just feel really full and just really grateful. I'm Minna, I know you saw on Facebook or Instagram that I had this, I lifted up your quote, "Women break through everything and go on living." And I just, yeah, I'm just so grateful. I'm just really deeply touched and deeply grateful for your work and what also, how it will live in conversation with my own going forward, because I just want to amplify more and more what you've brought to us. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
So very much. I mean, thank you both of you. Drew, this was really special to have you join us. And I really hope that we do continue to connect all of our work, and people, also in the audience. I know I can see that there are many people who are thinking around these same themes as well. So yeah, thank you. This was very beautiful. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we'll close out by giving you just 2 minutes of our next forum. I'll be sharing more information. We'll have Bayo Akomolafe join us on June 16th. It's not up on the website yet, but we'll have Bayo come back and we'll talk, and then I'll reach out to you as well, Minna, in case you're available. But we're gonna have a summit at the Garrison in July where Bayo's coming, and the theme is contemplating equity and fugitive futures. So it's going to be really exciting. So I'm sure you're busy, but I'll send the invitation in case you're available to come. And then everybody just thank you everybody for coming. I'll close by saying that sometimes when you think about feminist scholarship, whether it be from whatever tradition, whether it's white feminist scholars, black feminist scholars, uh, feminist scholars from the Far East, there tends to be this preconceived notion that because it's so connected to the feminine part of our wonderful species, that there's a softness to it and a tenderness and a really and that's true. But I also want you to leave understanding that there's a fierceness. There's a fierceness that is also embedded in this dialogue and in this work. A fierceness and a force. And as they say in my hood, we don't play games. Well, with that being said, I'd love to invite everyone to unmute. Everybody unmute and say goodbye in whatever form you'd love to say, and just continuing to sing praise for Minna and for Drew, who will be stepping into the lineage of eloquent writers like Minna, and the person that's next to Drew, next to the candle, Toni Morrison. Her spirit is here. Thank you so much, Minna. Muchas gracias a todo el mundo. Take good care, everybody. You can unmute yourself. We'd love to hear you.